Welcome back to another episode of LoyalTV. At the turn of the 20th century, Westerns topped the box office, chronicling the lives of iconic characters that shaped the frontier. But by the 1930s and 1940s, con men and imposters were coming out of the woodwork, claiming to be one living Wild West legend or another, and at a time when appearance and testimony were the only means of identification. One of these attention seekers was a supposed centenarian known to Lawton locals as J. Frank Dalton, who had attracted considerable attention by telling tales of being famed lawman Deputy U.S. Marshal Frank Dalton. However, when that scheme failed, his story changed, and it all began with a May 1948 issue of the Lawton Constitution that read, "Jesse James is alive in Lawton."
Well, during the 1940s, there were a lot of gents that were appearing, claiming to be one outlaw or lawman of infamy from the American West. And there was this man claiming to be J. Frank Dalton. He was a prominent lawman during the Indian Territory days, and he convinced a lot of people, a lot of retired lawmen. He seemed to know a lot about the Dalton family. The real J. Frank Dalton, he was a member of the, if I say the infamous Dalton family, the Dalton gang that was wiped out in Coffeyville, Kansas when they tried to rob 2 banks at once. The law was a funny thing back then. They needed hard men for Indian Territory. They could ride, they could shoot, and if you fit the bill, well, sometimes your past might be overlooked. And it was later determined that J. Frank Dalton had been killed in the line of duty in 1887. He then conceded that he was indeed Jesse James, who had faked his death in 1882 and traveled to the Indian Nation to hide out under an assumed name.
Now this tale adds a new character, a questionable man named Orvis Lee Houck, who claimed to be Dalton's, or should we say, James's grandson. Together they launched a PR campaign to convince the world. Headlines appeared in newspapers and affidavits were circulated to capitalize on the mythos of the notorious desperado. Houck began setting up rallies that drew crowds of up to 30,000 people to hear him speak.
They traveled extensively. They drew huge crowds. And this elder gentleman was able to convince a lot of people, including members of the James family, that he was indeed Jesse James. He claimed to have been shot. He claimed to have 32 bullet holes in his body. James is known to have been shot at least 7 times. He had a maimed finger, as James did, a rope-burned neck, and burned feet. So apparently he had these same markings on his body, so that was just one more thing. And when you have an audience who wants to believe, it doesn't take a lot of convincing. His last appearance was in Granbury, Texas in 1951. When he arrived by train, he was decrepit-looking, blind, and suffering from a broken hip. To make it to his appearance, an ambulance had to be called to transport him. But when he appeared at the presentation, he was apparently sharp. He passed away just a few days later, and he was buried in the Granbury Cemetery, and his tombstone announced to the world, "Here lies Jesse James." The body of J. Frank Dalton was exhumed. Now, the problem was it was an old cemetery, and sometimes tombstones get moved, and where his tombstone was, there were 2 caskets, and it was determined that whomever was in the casket did not belong to either the James or the Dalton family.
According to historical records, the real Jesse James was shot by a member of his own gang on April 3, 1882, in St. Joseph, Missouri, and then laid to rest about 50 miles away in his hometown of Kearney. In 1995, DNA testing concluded that the body believed to be Jesse James in Missouri was in fact the notorious outlaw. So who was the J. Frank Dalton from Lawton who is buried in Texas? Lawman? Outlaw? Or someone else altogether? While his true origin remains obscure, he left an unforgettable mark on Lawton.
He was a man of mystery. J. Frank Dalton was an unfortunate man just trying to make a living in the last years of his life, being exploited. It was really the only opportunity that he had. And there are a lot of people from Oklahoma who capitalized on this genre. It embodies freedom, adventure, excitement. The idea that Jesse James would have left his family and spent the last 69 years of his life struggling, and then spending the last few years of his life trying to explain to people who he really was, is just too hard to believe.
Thanks for joining us. Come back again for the best Oklahoma stories you've never heard, right here on LoyalTV.